your health and in your wealth, because it's simply not. Punchline, Jesus being given, Jesus applying his gospel to your life and making you new, that is the sign of God's favor in your life. You need to look nowhere else. That is God's favor in your life. The gospel of Jesus Christ, making what was dead, what was rank, what was estranged, bringing you into fellowship, bringing you into communion, giving you life, made alive together in Jesus Christ. That's the favor of God on your life, not your health and not your wealth. If you have health and wealth, is that a favorable thing? Sure. Is that a great thing for which we're thankful to God? Absolutely. But if your standard or your measure of God's favor towards you, God's blessing, God's love for you is measured in your health and wealth, what happens when you lose it? Because you will. Eventually, we all lose our health, right? We die. Pretty unhealthy. No one in my notes, but it was good. All right. Proponents of this health and wealth thing is Kenneth Copeland, Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, Bishop Eddie Long, Paula White, Joyce Meyer. If you like any of those people, I say do not anymore. If you listen to those people to gain anything, I say you gain pretty much nothing. This is, you don't hear me calling out names very often, but this is years and years and years of wasted time in front of an audience selling a bill of goods. And so to that I say it has to stop and they have to be called out. You need to know, as a shepherd protecting you from the wolves. They use signature verses like John 10:10. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Has nothing to do with your bank account. It has nothing to do with your 401k, right? Thanks, Ethan. It has nothing to do with whether you skirt through this life without cancer. It has nothing to do with any of those things, right? I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. The fullness of life is captured in the fullness of Christ and what he's given us through his gospel. James 4:2 is another signature verse for this movement. You do not have because you did not ask. If you just ask, you'll have. And that's not exactly the way that works. Trust me, I have asked for money so many times and have gotten nothing. Galatians 3:14, he redeemed us in order that the blessings given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ. I can't begin to tell you how far afield they take that passage and apply it to you in a health and wealth fashion. Word of faith, prosperity gospel, people say this verse is God's promise of financial blessing to Abraham and his descendants. They teach that the reason you can't get out of debt is because you lack faith. You lack faith. And if you listen closely, you can kind of hear the truth, right? There's an element of truth. There's ways that if we're in debt that we can be faithful and trust God and work towards getting out of that. Right? Well, my grocery budget might go from, Papa John's to whatever the cheapest thing you can find in the freezer at Walmart. Your budget might change a little bit because you're saying, God, I trust you. Lord, I'm going to pay off more of this because getting out of debt is good. It's godly, right? I'm going to pay this off. I'm going to work on this. I'm going to change the way in which I live. My means is going to change a little bit. And that's an expression of faith. Right, so that's good. T.D. Jakes tells us that if we plant a miracle faith seed by writing him a check, God will heal your marriages and he'll increase your bank account. And that's just not true. So what does the Bible say? So that's a little bit of prosperity teaching. That's a little bit of that platform that presents to us an altered version of generosity, of giving, of how the Lord meets our needs and blesses us. And it takes the attention away from the gospel, takes the attention away from what Christ has done and what he's made us, and into something totally different. It changes what the favor of God on man rests upon. And it's not Christ. But what does the Bible say? Well, let's begin to read. Let's begin to read in 1 Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, reading verses 1 through 11. Here's the context. The Corinthian church has put together a gift so Paul takes the opportunity to talk about the attitude towards giving. Right? That's what's happening here. Right? They've got this gift ready, and he wants to take the opportunity to speak towards generosity and kind of inform them on a right doctrine, right? A theology of generosity, if you will. He says, "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. It is unnecessary. For I know your willingness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I have sent the brothers in order that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you will be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, would be put to shame by this confidence. So I considered it necessary to urge the brothers that they go on ahead of you and arrange in advance your previously promised generous gift, and that the same would be ready as a generous gift and not as one grudgingly given due to greediness. Now I say this, the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows generously will also reap generously. Each one must do as he has decided in his own heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to make all grace overflow to you, so that, always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance of every good need. As it is written, scattered abroad, he gave to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. Producing thanksgiving to God. So where did this come from? This idea of tithing, right? Because we didn't make it up, right? This has been around for quite a while. So let's see kind of where this framework began to be constructed, where it came from. So a good place to start is with the Old Covenant concept of tithing. Here's its structure, okay? You have several instances first in like Leviticus 27. By the way, this whole system, right, given through the law, the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Law, which really served like an income tax in Israel's economic law, right? Some of this is classroomy and heady, but some of it is very applicable and heartworthy, I guess. A tithe just means a tenth, by the way. If you didn't know, there were a few different tithes collected in Israel throughout the Old Covenant. First, in Leviticus 27, it tells us that a tithe of all the produce and flocks was to be set aside for the Lord. This tithe was given to the Levites, enabling them to serve in the tabernacle full time since they didn't receive the inheritance or an inheritance of the land. They, in turn, were to tithe to support the Levitical priests. That's Numbers 18. Second, in Deuteronomy, we see that a tenth of one's produce and flocks were to be eaten at the central sanctuary. Deuteronomy 12 and 14 expresses this. Here's something interesting. God was commanding his people to save up for a big party once a year in his honor. Remember, part of bringing God's glory is in enjoying his gifts in ways that honor him. God is not a cruel miser, but he loves to bless his people. He loves to bless his people. And he loves people to enjoy the blessings that he so richly and bountifully provides. Finally, we see that every third year a tithe was to go into a local storehouse to feed the poor, Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows, Deuteronomy 14 and chapter 26. In addition, to these three tithes, Israel had a temple tax. That's Exodus 30. So you had voluntary offerings, Deuteronomy 12. You had gleanings of the field that was to be left for the poor, Leviticus 19, and additional taxes levied during the monarchy, 2 Kings. So you had a lot of variations of tithing, of offering that God instructed them to do. We understand that a tithe means tenth, and we've kind of operated that way for a long time. right? You don't see that expressed in the New Testament, but we've kind of just held on to that and we operate that way. When I'm going to argue that in the New Testament or in the New Covenant, there's a different expression and a different structure that comes with a new covenant as it pertains to generosity, as it pertains to giving. But here you have this system that's built up, and even the 10th is a little bit out of focus, because in reality, when it came to all that they were giving, it was over 20%. It was over 20%. So I would say to people that are super married to that 10% because of old covenant and you're hanging on to that, well, then beef that up a little bit to a little bit over 20% to be very consistent, right? Because that's what they would have actually been given when you total it all up. And you can fact check me on that, right? So there's a paper trail you can read and find. And when you put all these things together, scholars have come across this long before I was born. And that's the reality. So there's your old covenant. You had this system put in place, this Mosaic law put in place. A part of that, a part of their fidelity to God, a part of their worship even, was in giving these different forms of taxes that covered, or different forms of tithing that covered different things. So under the old covenant, tithing was a covenantal requirement tied to Israel's theocratic and ceremonial system. The tithes were not voluntary gifts, but binding aspects of the covenant between God and national Israel. Those tithes were connected to the temple, to the priesthood, to the land, and all of which were types and shadows pointing to what? Christ. But with Jesus came the obsolescence of the old covenant and the inauguration of the new. So what happens to the old covenant practice of tithing with the inauguration of the new covenant? We'll move forward. So here's some new covenant tithing structure. Nowhere in the New Testament are we commanded to give 10%. There is a reference in the gospel. I believe Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees. And he talks about you give your 10th, but his point is saying you're good about your piety and you're good about your outward service. Remember, whitewashed tombs, right? He said, but where you fail is in mercy ministry. You fail in these major areas. His point is not to say tithe. His point is to say you're missing heart ministry. You go through motions. You're like a clock. You're like a clock that doesn't think about what it's doing. It's just performing because it's got a battery. So nowhere in the New Testament are we commanded to give 10%. Instead, what we see in 1 Corinthians 16:2 is a simple admonition to give in keeping with our income, which will come later. So what happened to the 10%? Well, the tithe, like animal sacrifices, the schedule of festivals and priestly offices were all part of God's regulation under Old Covenant of how his people were to worship him. Once Jesus came along, he announces in the Sermon on the Mount that he fulfills the entire Old Covenant. Matthew 5:17. All of the worship ordinances in the Old Testament were pointing to him, as the author of Hebrews has labored to show us. Once Jesus came along, those are no longer needed because one greater than the temple is here. And we become the temple. So there's no more temple because we are the temple, no more temple tax because we are the temple. We do not pay priests because Jesus became our high priest. We don't have that priestly system because it was a part of the old order. This is why Jesus declares the temple tax inapplicable to his followers in Matthew 17. He says, "What do you think, Simon?" Jesus asked. "From whom do the kings of earth collect duty and taxes? From their..." Peter answered, "Then the sons are exempt." And Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are exempt," Jesus said to him. Jesus is the Son of God.